Hello everyone, this is Sam of Historiansplaining. A historian tells you why everything you know is wrong. These lectures are on SoundCloud, Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, and other platforms. If you can help to keep them coming, please go to my Patreon page. The link is in the description. So I'm about to play for you a lecture that I recorded 1 year ago for patrons. It's my longest, most complex, most ambitious lecture that I've yet produced, topping out at just over 4 hours, and it's on Myth of the Month, number 20, Conspiracy Theories. And in the year since I posted this lecture, I've had some wonderful gains in the number of patrons, which is very encouraging, but I've also had a lot of setbacks, including a lot of declines on Patreon, which have negated a lot of those gains. So if you can by any chance help to keep these lectures going, and if you want to hear all of the patron-only materials that I post right when I post them without the 1 year delay, then please sign up as a patron, and it's tremendously appreciated. But here is the first part of my lecture, dealing particularly with the question of how seriously one should take conspiracy theories and whether to regard them primarily as theories or primarily as myths. So without further ado, here is the first part of the lecture. Hello everyone, this is Sam of Historiansplaining. A historian tells you why everything you know is wrong, and this will be the beginning of a lecture for patrons, Myth of the Month, number 20, Conspiracy Theories. So I said previously that I wanted something big and dramatic and special for the 20th Myth of the Month, and at this point I can say I think that conspiracy theories are the most complex and most difficult topic that I have tried to tackle so far in Historiansplaining. It's a difficult subject not just because conspiracy theories by their very nature and even by definition are controversial, and not only because they're a subject of particularly intense concern and even fear today, but also because it's a very conceptually complicated and multi-layered subject. So on the one hand, one can speak of conspiracy theories as a phenomenon. What are they? What sort of social and political purposes do they serve? Why do some people embrace them and not others? What agendas can they forward? But also at the same time, one has to question and examine the very category of conspiracy theories. Why is it that we take these various different notions, speculations, arguments about different sorts of plots, crimes, or cover-ups, and group them together into this one basket? And why do we have such highly developed and specific and even emotional connotations about conspiracy theories and about the sort of people who subscribe to them? The notion of the conspiracy theorist. How did this category and this idea come about, and what sort of purposes does it serve? So there are not only questions that one has to ask and that people want to know answers to and have been examining now for decades about conspiracy theories themselves, but beyond that there are also meta questions, questions about the questions that we ask. Why do we want to know these particular things, like who believes in conspiracy theories and why, and what sort of people are they, what drives them, and why do we treat this specific range of phenomena as so different and distinct from any other realm of discourse, theorizing, speculation, and so on. So this is a very complicated topic to try to pick apart. There's no way that this discussion can ever be comprehensive, but I'm just going to try to bring some perspective to it, just as a historian who has encountered both real conspiracies and theories about conspiracy in my own work. My dissertation research, as you probably have heard, was about Freemasonry. So of course I have to encounter these ideas, these arguments, these controversies. And the current arguments coming up today about the dangers of so-called misinformation, disinformation, naturally resonate with things that I've seen and encountered from decades or hundreds of years ago. So I'm just going to try to give some historical perspective to both these theories and to the idea of conspiracy theories as such. And since this is so complex, I'm probably going to record this in parts and pieces over several days. And it's been difficult to try to figure out how to even begin this discussion, but in my readings over the last few days, I found that I think I ought to begin with a story that can serve as a little bit of a thought experiment. So to begin, this story takes place round about 2,000 years ago in the capital city of a great empire. And we won't worry just yet about what city or what empire. But I want you to think and imagine that you are a servant. We'll say that your name is Mr. M. You are an ex-slave, or a so-called freedman, who is now working as a paid servant in the household of a wealthy, powerful aristocrat. We will call him Lord S. So one day, you're going about your business and your chores in the household of Lord S while he is away visiting with a friend. When he returns, he begins to make to you a series of requests that strike you as a little unusual. The first one is that he asks you to bring him the tablets on which he has written his last will and testament. He seems to look them over, make a couple of small changes, and then he asks you to put them back in their place for safekeeping. He then pulls out the dagger that he keeps regularly as a sort of ceremonial item in its holster. He tells you that this dagger has gotten dull and rusty, and he asks you to freshen it up, to sharpen it with a stone, and to make it bright and sharp. So you do so, and you give it back to him. Subsequent to this, he asks the cooks to put on a dinner for the entire household. And it's an unusually sumptuous and lavish dinner. He puts out a great deal of food and wine for all the family members and servants. And he begins giving out gifts, something that he has done before on occasion, usually when he's in a good mood. So he gives out gifts of money to the various servants and slaves, and to some of his favorite slaves he even grants them their freedom. So this makes for a very happy occasion. But you notice that Lord S looks a little odd. He seems to be pensive, deep in thought, a bit grave, although at moments he puts on a show of joviality and engages in light conversation. Finally, after the dinner is done and being cleared away, he asks you, Mr. M, to prepare gauze and linen into bandages, and to make pastes that could serve to heal and dress wounds, and to have all of these ready by this evening. So, I want you to think for a moment, if you were Mr. M, what would you make of all this, and what might you do? Would it seem to you as if maybe something was up? Maybe something serious? What could it be? Asking for his dagger to be sharpened, asking to revise his will and have it put away again. Maybe he's thinking of suicide, giving away money and other gifts. But then again, why all the bandages and the pastes to heal wounds? Something perhaps doesn't seem right. And suppose then that you go to your wife, we'll just call her Mrs. M, and you point out that these things seem strange to you, and that you're feeling suspicions. And your wife confirms, yes, she agrees, something does seem to be up. And she reminds you not only that, but that Lord S is known to have friends and compatriots in the upper class who are critics and political opponents of the emperor. And she further reminds you that if some sort of plot, perhaps against the emperor, is afoot, that you'd better tell someone, because whoever reveals this plot, or at least gets an investigation going, is likely to be richly rewarded with money, and if it's you, you may be freed from ever having to work as a servant again. You may get a nice retirement nest egg, and perhaps all kinds of other honors and rewards from the emperor, if your suspicions are correct. Moreover, Your wife, Mrs. M, also points out that everyone else in the household has also seen these strange behaviors. So if you do not step forward and blow the whistle, very likely someone else will. And if they do, not only will suspicion immediately fall upon Lord S, but maybe you as well. You have sharpened the dagger. You have prepared bandages. Maybe the onus now is on you to step forward and say what you have seen and what you suspect. Now, of course, on the other side, if you blow the whistle, so to speak, and you're wrong, you're risking a great deal. Not only will you then immediately become an enemy of your employer, but moreover, you may even be in danger of some sort of criminal punishment for falsely accusing him. You may become unemployable as a servant. So these are the sort of things that you, as Mr. M, have to weigh. Now, after thinking about that for a moment, let's suppose that Mr. M weighs these different concerns and he decides to go forward and tell what he's seen. So he goes down the street to the gardens of one of the imperial palaces, and he bangs on the gate. And the guard, hearing that Mr. M has some sort of urgent, pressing matter to present to the emperor, he lets the servant in and leads him to a scribe and secretary who works in the imperial palace. Let's call him E. So now, let's imagine for a moment that you are this imperial secretary, and here is a servant, a former slave, who says that he has information that can reveal that his employer, Lord S, is involved in some sort of nefarious plot, likely to kill and overthrow the emperor. And what is his basis for this accusation? Being asked to sharpen a dagger, being asked to make some bandages, the fact that his employer was giving away some money and giving freedom to some of his favorite slaves, and the claim that he looked somehow strangely gloomy or pensive. And ask yourself, if you are Lord E, can you believe this person? Maybe he just hates his employer. Maybe he's making petty revenge. Can you even know that what he's saying is true? And even if everything he's claiming is true, is that really enough to go and bother the emperor himself? Would you stake your credibility on this person's accusations and suspicions? And what sort of consequences might await you if you tell the emperor that you think this person should be listened to? Will you lose face? Or, contrarily, will you gain favor if it turns out that Mr. M is really onto something? So I've asked you to think, firstly, what would you think and what would you do if you were Mr. M? And then what would you think and what would you do if you were Mr. E and you had to weigh and judge whether to take Mr. M's accusations and insinuations seriously, and whether they ought to be brought to official attention? Now, thirdly, let's suppose that Mr. E decides to take the risk and take what Mr. M is saying seriously enough to bring it directly to the emperor. So Mr. E and the guard and Mr. M together go to the imperial audience room, and they're then joined shortly after by another witness who is now followed along, which is Mrs. M, the servant's wife. And at their behest, Mr. M begins to tell his story about the strange things he has seen and the strange requests he's been given by Lord S. And now suppose you're the emperor, and the alleged threat is against you. What do you think then? Can you judge this sort of accusation or allegation clearly in an impartial or unbiased way? Are you going to be moved towards panic and move against a powerful aristocrat based on these unsubstantiated allegations by a servant? Or are you going to be too cavalier, too careless, and allow this early sign, this early hint of a possible plot against your life to slip through your fingers? What would you do? Well, perhaps many of you would do the rather obvious thing, which is to send out guards to arrest and summon Lord S and bring him to the imperial audience chamber and question him about these allegedly strange actions. So this is what you do. You bring in Lord S and there, alongside Mr. M and Mrs. M and the secretary, Mr. E, you question him. Is it true that you asked to revise your will and have it put away? Is it true that you had your dagger sharpened? Is it true that you made inordinate gifts and an inordinately large and sumptuous dinner for your household? Is it true that you asked for bandages to be made? And Lord S responds to these questions firmly, confidently. There is nothing strange or unusual about my behavior on this day. It is normal for wealthy men with complicated financial and property dealings to occasionally revise their will. I have done this many times before, Lord S says. Nothing unusual about this day. I did ask for my dagger to be sharpened by Mr. M. Nothing unusual or strange about that either. It is a special ceremonial instrument consecrated for use in sacrificial rituals in temples. And because I hadn't used it in a while, I wanted it to be kept sharp for that purpose. It's true that I held a sumptuous dinner, and I gave out gifts and granted freedom to some of my slaves. I have done that many times before, and at this particular time, my finances have been in a bit of trouble. I have various debts. I was concerned that my will might not be fully honored, and so I decided to give out some of these gifts first. And as for the bandages, I never made that request at all. That is a lie and an embellishment by this untrustworthy and malicious servant, Mr. M, who simply wanted to add a note of suspicion to what was otherwise not a terribly unusual day. So naturally a back and forth ensues between Lord S and Mr. M over who is telling the truth and who is lying. And it seems as if things are at an impasse until another factor comes into the conversation that reveals a possibly different line of inquiry. And it comes from Mrs. M, who interjects to point out something that Mr. M had failed to mention before. She explains that in the morning of this day in question, Lord S had been away and out of the house because he had gone for a somewhat long visit to the house of his friend, another wealthy, powerful aristocrat. We'll call him Lord A. And the two of them had conferred and had a long conversation in private, with no wives, no servants, nobody else present. And it was only after returning from this visit to Lord A that then Lord S began to make these peculiar requests and to show these strange behaviors. Now, at this point, the next step might seem fairly obvious to many of you, which is that you, the Emperor, now should send out guards to arrest and escort to the palace Lord A. And most importantly, you must keep Lord S and Lord A separate and question each of them separately about the entire content and purpose of their private meeting on that morning, and see whether or not their accounts match. Now, at this point, some of you might want to know what was the outcome of that questioning, because, as many of you by now have probably guessed, this story that I have been recounting really happened. These events happened in the city of Rome in the year AD 65. Mr. M was a servant named Milicus, who was working in the home of the senatorial gentleman and politician Scaevinus. Scaevinus had met in the home of a fellow politician and senator, Antonius Natalis. The secretary who received these accusations from Milicus and brought him to the emperor was a Greek former slave named Epaphroditus, and the emperor in question was Nero. So what was the result of this little inquiry sparked by Milicus's allegations? Well, the two senators, Scaevinus and Antonius Natalis, were questioned, and their stories did not match at all. It quickly became obvious that there was some sort of secret or nefarious dealings going on between them that they didn't want to reveal. And once the guards made this clear to both of these prisoners, they saw that they had no way to escape suspicion. The plot had been caught. Either one of them, inevitably was going to sell out the other. And so for each of them, the only possible chance at saving their neck was by giving over information, revealing the plot, revealing who had masterminded it, who had recruited them, how they intended to kill and overthrow the emperor, and with whom they planned to replace him. So the basic idea was for Scaevinus, who was an honored, powerful gentleman, to approach Nero the following day at the Circus Maximus, where he regularly appeared publicly, to stab him, then for loyal Praetorian guards who were privy to the conspiracy to surround both Scaevinus to protect him and the emperor to finish him off, and then for another detachment of guards to go find the highly respected and ambitious senator and orator named Piso, where he would be waiting in the temple of Ceres, and to usher him to an army camp where he would be proclaimed emperor. So as a result of this plot being exposed, dozens of people were accused, imprisoned, and questioned. Ultimately, 19 people were executed, including Piso, Antonius Natalis, and Scaevinus. Meanwhile, Milicus, the servant who had first blown the whistle, was richly rewarded, and he was even given the honorific surname Soter, meaning savior. So Nero and his regime survived this threat, thanks to the keen eye and candor of Milicus and his wife. However, his harsh punishments of so many of the conspirators, even after many of them had confessed, only added to Nero's unpopularity among the upper classes of Rome. 3 years later, in AD 68, he was openly overthrown when the Senate itself denounced him and declared him a hostis, or enemy of the people. Nero then, as a result, fled from the city and later committed suicide rather than be captured. His secretary, Epaphroditus, fled with him. He survived the overthrow of Nero, went on to serve several other later emperors, but eventually was killed by the mad emperor Domitian, reportedly as punishment for failing to prevent the suicide of Nero. So these are the basic bare facts that we know of the fates of those who were involved in the so-called Pisonian conspiracy and the people who revealed and thwarted it in AD 65. The story of this conspiracy and of the particular incident by which it was revealed is recounted in some detail in the chronicles of the Roman senator and historian Tacitus. Niccolò Machiavelli, the Italian Renaissance scholar and statesman, also included a shorter summary of these same events in his Discourses, specifically in the Discourses, Book 3, Section 6, titled On Conspiracies. And Machiavelli uses this incident as an example to support several claims that he makes in this essay on conspiracies. One is just the basic broad claim that runs through the entire chapter, that conspiracies are real, they take place frequently, and they are a real serious threat to all regimes, both republics and monarchies. And he actually, at the beginning of the section, he even argues, quote, "It is plain that many more princes have lost their lives and their states in this way," meaning by conspiracies, "than by open war, because it is given to but few to make open war on a prince, whereas anyone can conspire against him." A second point by Machiavelli that this story about the Pisonian conspiracy serves to illustrate is about who undertakes and carries out conspiracies. Machiavelli argues that nearly all of them are led and plotted by people of high status, near the top of society, those closest to the ruler or the organs of government. And Machiavelli makes an argument that this is so for reasons of means, motive, and opportunity. They have more means, they have money and influence that they can use to recruit people to help in their plot and to keep them silent and prevent them from revealing the conspiracy. Motive. Machiavelli argues that psychologically, those who are of high status and who are already highly honored and powerful in society are more likely to desire and to imagine themselves ascending all the way to the pinnacle of rule, whether that means overthrowing and replacing the monarch in a monarchy, or overthrowing the laws in the Constitution and seizing personal power in a republic. And he argues they have the greatest opportunity. Specifically, they have the most privileged personal access to the ruler himself. And again, that is illustrated specifically in this incident by the fact that Scaevinus was the one who was intended to personally approach and then strike the first blow upon the emperor at the Circus Maximus. A third important point that Machiavelli uses this story to illustrate, and the point that he's actually making more specifically in this particular section of On Conspiracies, where he brings up the exposure of the Pisonian conspiracy, is that most conspiracies fail. They are extremely dangerous and risky undertakings. It's very hard to put together an effective plot and carry it all the way through to execution. The biggest reason why most conspiracies fail is because they have to involve two or more people, almost by definition. There are occasionally lone lunatics, lone assassins, who try, almost always unsuccessfully, to kill a ruler. But in order to actually carry through successfully a plan to overthrow a regime and replace it, you have to have several different people who take on different tasks. And almost inevitably, somebody is going to spill the beans. The secret is going to come out one way or another. Usually, this happens because someone who has been brought into the conspiracy turns coat and exposes what has been going on in hopes of getting reward, in hopes of not only escaping from the danger of torture or imprisonment or death if the conspiracy should fail, but even gets that incentive of possible reward and glory if they tell the ruler what is going on. Now, nonetheless, even as Machiavelli makes clear, even in those cases, which sometimes happen where all the conspirators keep faith, no one exposes what they are up to, and the plot even might come very close to execution, like it did in Rome in AD 65. Even then, it's very likely that somebody, through keen observation, is going to suspect what's going on, and they will instead blow the whistle, as happened here with Milicus, the servant in the household of Scaevinus. So this incident that appears in Tacitus's annals and then is brought up again in Machiavelli's Discourses, it illustrates all of these different points, these different meanings that Machiavelli tries to take from it. The pervasiveness and the real threat of conspiracies, the fact that conspiracies are usually elite-driven affairs, and the fact that most of them, almost all, are exposed before they can come to fruition. Now, if we back up for a minute and look at these arguments Machiavelli is making, the first two, about the frequency and the real danger of conspiracies, and the fact that they are elite affairs, by and large, these two could be taken basically as support for the people that we see around us today, in recent years, let's say within the past 100 years, who see conspiracies and allege conspiracies, and who claim that they can discern the signs and the clues of conspiratorial plots in the world around us. It seems as if we could say Machiavelli backs those people up, those so-called conspiracy theorists. In fact, we could even say, in a sense, if we take the term as broadly as possible, we could say in a sense that Machiavelli was the original conspiracy theorist. He was the first person to philosophize in a general sense about conspiracies as such, and to argue that they are real and important subjects of serious investigation, and that it is largely among the powerful and the elites of society that one should look for conspiracies. So in this sense, we might say Machiavelli himself was a conspiracy theorist. But then, if we look at his third point, where he points out the vast majority of conspiracies fail because it is almost impossible to keep a plot to overthrow a government secret, that could be taken as a countervailing point that the critics or opponents of conspiracy theorists might agree with. These so-called, paranoid, delusional theorists do not understand that these conspiracies almost never can come to fruition. It is almost impossible, as I've said before in other contexts, it's almost impossible to imagine that, say, the moon landing was plausibly faked, because so many people were involved in that project, and so many people brought back evidence, photographs, eyewitness accounts, and it is simply not plausible by any stretch of the ordinary reasoning mind. It is not plausible that all of those people were all lying and all faking, and that all of them effectively kept the secret, and nobody ever exposed what they were up to. It is, in my estimation, it is far simpler and far more plausible to say that NASA and the Apollo program launched a fairly small rocket into space and got two men, onto the moon, than it is to think that they managed this elaborate hoax and kept it secret through all those years and all the subsequent decades. So you could take Machiavelli's third point as a blow against what we think of now as conspiracy theories. And yet, there's a paradox here. This is one of many paradoxes surrounding the subject of conspiracy theories, which is that, in this instance, when it comes to the Pisonian conspiracy, it was not an insider or a participant who uncovered what was happening. It was a third party. It was an observer who put together what he considered to be suspicious clues, and used that as a basis to call for an investigation and to call for action. So in this case, if one had said, "Milikus, we don't believe you, because the vast majority of conspiracies fail," well then, they would have failed to uncover what was going on, and then the conspiracy would have succeeded. It was close to completion before it was caught, and before Scaevinus and Antonius Natalis were arrested. And it was this outside observer, someone who was using their instincts, their intuitions, in order to piece together clues and form suspicions, form a theory. So one could equally say that Milikus himself was a conspiracy theorist. So if we take conspiracy theorist to mean a person who puts forward theories and arguments that some particular conspiracy is afoot, is taking place or has taken place, well, in that sense, there is no original conspiracy theorist. It's not Machiavelli, it's all these people through the ages, like Milikus himself, who have raised doubts, who have raised suspicions, who have raised accusations about plots and conspiracies, and who sometimes have turned out to be correct, whose suspicions have then been borne out. So the paradox that I'm trying to draw out here is that on the one hand, we might say conspiracy theorists are delusional because the vast majority of conspiracies and plots are impossible to carry out and fail long before they reach fruition. And yet, part of why that is so is because of the suspicions raised by conspiracy theorists themselves. Now, some of you very understandably might be saying, no, that's not what we mean by conspiracy theorist either. Milikus was being rational. Milikus was putting forward a factual argument based on his own eyewitness testimony, events that he had witnessed himself. He was not delusional, he was not making things up. But that, of course, assumes that a conspiracy theorist is an irrational or insane or dishonest actor. And in that sense, one is sort of begging the question. Conspiracy theorists are wrong because they're wrong, and if it turns out one of them is right, then they're not a conspiracy theorist, right? So at best, that's a no true Scotsman fallacy, right? We create this category of people, we say that they're always insane, they're always wrong. If one of them turns out to be right, then we simply take them out of the category. It's just a fallacy in a form of circular reasoning. But let's say we put that aside for another minute. That may be jumping ahead. And let's say we go back to Machiavelli and what he is arguing, and see what we make of it from our perspective. Well, as I said, Machiavelli makes certain points about conspiracies, which we now, 500 years later, can weigh and evaluate from the perspective of our time. One of them is that initial claim that plots and conspiracies are very frequent, and that they are much more often the cause of the death or overthrow of the rulers of states than open warfare is. Well, at least that point we have to take as valid right up into recent times. If we think of, say, presidents of the United States, 4 of them have been killed by assassins, and several others have been shot and have had attempts made on their lives. But never has one single American president been felled in battle. And the same statement can hold true for heads of state and heads of government around the world in recent times. They are insulated from the danger of actual attack. It is much more often a plot or a conspiracy. You might think, just for one example, of Salvador Allende being overthrown and dying in the presidential palace in Chile in 1973. This sort of thing happens frequently, whereas deaths on the battlefield are really no longer a serious consideration at all for heads of government or heads of state. But, on the other hand, you might say, that's not really what Machiavelli was talking about either. So Machiavelli also makes the argument that conspiracies are very difficult to carry out because you need someone who has direct personal access to the ruler, and you need to have a network of people to work out the plan, the opportunity, the weapons, and to figure out what will happen once the ruler has actually been killed. Now, Machiavelli was writing in a time when, say for instance, firearms were still very primitive. It wasn't really possible to conceal an enormous, flintlock musket or an arquebus and then pull it out of one's trench coat and somehow load it and fire it in direct proximity of a king or an emperor or a president. Really, assassinations and political murders in Machiavelli's time basically had to be carried out in the same way that they were in ancient Rome in the time of Tacitus or Livy, which is through a stabbing weapon, probably a dagger, or else more stealthily using poison. But either of those required special privileged access to the body and presence of the ruler, and they required skill and special materials. Not everyone knew how to kill someone with a dagger. It took practice and planning, and much less with poison. Someone had to somehow obtain the poison, and when one did so, the person who supplied the poison either had to be kept in the dark about what you were doing with it, or they had to be brought knowingly into the conspiracy. And either of those tacks involved risks and dangers of exposure. So situations have changed over the last 500 years. There's been a proliferation now of small, effective weapons, especially handguns, that are commonly used in assassinations or assassination attempts. And that changes the situation somewhat. So Machiavelli argues that, well, if you're going to assassinate a ruler, it really requires more than one person. It requires an actual conspiracy. People coming together, plotting, planning, cooperating. That isn't necessarily so anymore, or at least it's very open to question. And this particular change is actually, I think, the hinge point that has brought about a great deal of this controversy, fear, conflict, acrimony over this question of conspiracy theories. What is the number one event that has been the great flashpoint, more than any other, of conspiracy theorizing over the last century? It's the assassination of John F. Kennedy in 1963, which was carried out not by a small handgun, but by a sort of sniper rifle. I'm not an expert on firearms. You can correct me if I'm not describing this exactly right. But it was with a rifle with a scope, through which Lee Harvey Oswald aimed and fired at the head of President John F. Kennedy. And the tremendous controversy arose because official investigators came to the conclusion that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone, that this was an effective assassination of the President of the United States and the so-called leader of the free world by one lone, insane gunman. This is exactly the sort of thing that Machiavelli in his book argued was impossible, and he cites examples of a deranged subject attacking and stabbing King Ferdinand of Aragon. He cites a dervish or Sufi who attacked and tried to kill the Ottoman emperor, but who were unsuccessful, and who had no plan or conception of what would happen next. They were, you could say, the ancient equivalent, the pre-modern equivalent of a lone gunman. But they failed, whereas Lee Harvey Oswald succeeded. And it is that conclusion that he acted alone, that the most powerful person on earth could just be felled almost instantly, in a matter of seconds, by some random, unknown, unimportant individual. That was exactly the notion that millions of people found inconceivable or unacceptable, and that then gave rise to enormous controversies, which I will not talk about and I will not get into. Plenty of people have studied these ideas, these arguments, but it is that exact question: is it really conceivable that one single individual could bring about a massive, world-changing disaster, even just by one pull of the trigger? That, I think, is the change, and that is the shocking development that has launched the question of conspiracy theories so close to the center of our modern day politics, discourse, scholarship, that has led to an obsession, not only with alleged plots and conspiracies, but an obsession with the very idea of conspiracy theories, in a way that I think would have been inconceivable to Machiavelli. Now finally, after having made this observation about the difference in our experiences, in our perspective, from Machiavelli's, lastly, I just want to comment on what I think we have to take from this story of Milicus and Scaevinus and the Emperor Nero. Why did I tell the story in the particular way I did? I asked you to think at various points, at 3 points in that story, about some particular character's perspective and the judgments they had to make. First, Milicus the servant, seeing the behavior of his employer. Then Epaphroditus, the secretary, receiving these accusations and allegations from Milicus and having to judge whether they were important enough or credible enough to then pursue, to take seriously, to bring to the attention of the authorities. And then thirdly, the perspective of Nero himself, who has to hear these speculations and hear also the counter-arguments and the refutations, and try to weigh and judge whom to believe and how to figure out what is or is not the truth. I tell the story that way because I believe that in the modern world, everyone, not just government officials, not just scholars, all people in society find themselves repeatedly in each of those 3 different positions. All of us often see things happening around us that seem suspicious, that seem to point towards hidden motives, towards ill intent. And we have to decide, are we crazy? Are we on to something? Who do we talk to? Do we bring it to our spouse? Do we bring it to our friends? Do we bring it to the authorities? And even more frequently than that, all of us, and part of why I'm making this lecture now, is that all of us even more consistently and frequently find ourselves in the position of the secretary Epaphroditus, hearing allegations, claims from supposed eyewitnesses, alleged clues based in strange behaviors, violations of ordinary patterns, and having to weigh whether to take these theories seriously or to dismiss them as baseless or delusional. And finally, we often find ourselves in the position of Nero, and I don't mean here for Nero to simply be a stand-in for official authorities. Nero is simply the person who is the alleged victim, the alleged target of a supposed conspiracy. Someone who may feel afraid and who has to decide whether to respond to that fear by reassuring himself that it's all delusions, there's nothing credible behind it, everything that seems suspicious is really innocent or ordinary, or to respond by trying to investigate and pursuing the accusations, all of us in different ways find ourselves in these different epistemic positions and having to sort through and make judgments about what is true or false, what may be true, what may be false, and to weigh probabilities. How possible, how realistic is this danger, how plausible? So why does that matter? Well, there are two basic reasons. One is that on the one hand, we have to remember that conspiracy theories are theories. They're arguments that claim that certain events have taken place, and they draw upon evidence and assert that their theory is the best and simplest possible explanation for that evidence. So, on this level, conspiracy theories are theories just like any other. If one is interested in their truth or falsehood, one has to weigh and evaluate the logic and the evidence behind them precisely the same way as one does with any other theory. And that's a point I'll get back to and elaborate on further. But meanwhile, on the other hand, it is normal, it is natural, and it is sometimes helpful to use shortcuts, to ask questions that may not have a direct bearing on the validity of the theory itself, but that can help us as sort of shortcuts, shortcut tools to deal with this constant dilemma that we're faced with over and over again of what to do when suspicions and allegations come into our lives. And of course, among those is to evaluate the credibility of the person making the argument. Now, this is a classic fallacy, right? This is what Aristotle calls the ad hominem fallacy, where you reject an argument not because it's logically faulty or because it's unsupported, but because of the person who's making it. It is true, if you point to who made this accusation, that does not actually tell you whether it's true or not, but it is a recourse that we sometimes fall back on, because otherwise it's too overwhelming. Looking at the world with all of these claims, all of these theories, all of these arguments and counter-arguments, and having to somehow sort through them one by one. One reaction to that situation, that feeling of being overwhelmed, is to simply accept uncertainty. That's where I try to err, is on the side of accepting that there's a lot I don't know. And in one lifetime I'm not going to adjudicate whether every conspiracy is true or false. And I have to come to that position because, as a historian, as a podcaster, people come to me asking, is this theory true? Is there anything to this? Is this credible? Whether it's theories about Freemasons or the French Revolution, anarchists or Illuminati or whatever. And, well, it would be easy to simply brush them all aside and say, all of that is nonsense. That's the sort of thing crazy, wild-eyed conspiracy theorists believe in. I know, as Machiavelli said, and as others have rightly pointed out, conspiracies do happen, and sometimes those fringe theories turn out to be true. I could get into some examples, and maybe I will a little later. But the point here is that one has to strike a fine balance between simply throwing up one's hands and saying, who knows, anything and everything might be true, and on the other hand, using easy, cheap expedients, and rhetorically, using the category and the label of conspiracy theory to simply reject out of hand arguments or allegations that you don't like, that for one reason or another you find politically inconvenient, or that you find as personal affronts, and to simply fall back on what is really at root an ad hominem fallacy, the idea that certain arguments must be wrong because of the people who put them forward, and the fact that they are somehow crazy or irrational or prejudiced or subversive or what have you. So this hopefully brings together in some way, links the two different types of questions that I brought up at the beginning of this discussion, which is, on the one hand, questions about conspiracy theories themselves. What sort of plots and evil intentions do they tend to impute? Who do they tend to blame? What sort of feelings, what suspicions, what loyalties, what identities do people express through conspiracy theories? And then, on the other hand, this higher level meta question of why do we talk about conspiracy theories as a category and as a type of thought unto itself, distinct from all other sorts of theories or ideas or arguments? And why do we have this highly developed, vivid image and stereotype of the conspiracy theorist as a distinct type of person? When and how did that come about? And what sort of loyalties, what agendas, what identities are expressed? What goals are furthered by the use of that rhetorical category? And why has it become an object of almost obsessive pursuit and examination in current discourse and even in social and psychological scholarship? Okay, so I hope maybe this has clarified and set out some of the stakes of this conversation and how I'm trying to approach it in as impartial a way as possible. So conspiracy theories are so amorphous and ambiguous a topic that it's almost impossible to figure out how to begin to attack it. But to give credit where credit is due, conspiracy theorists themselves are masters at simplifying complexity and at discerning signals amid the noise, amid what seems to be chaos. So in that spirit, I want to take this basic scenario, this story that I told about the Pisonian conspiracy in ancient Rome, and push it as far as it can go. So let's keep using this scenario, this situation where we can imagine ourselves in the position of the Emperor Nero in the audience chamber, questioning accusers, questioning the conspiracy theorist, and then questioning the accused, and hearing and weighing the counter-arguments. But let's imagine that instead of a particular theory or a particular accusation that's being put forward, it is conspiracy theories themselves as a collective phenomenon that we are examining and putting on trial. So the goal here is not to make judgments about any particular disputed theory. That is not the point of this thought exercise. It's not the point of this lecture. And I'm not going to make pronouncements on any sort of controversial or disputed theories and whether they're true or false. But rather, we're going to simply accept that some may be true if they have strong corroborating evidence and if the people or institutions involved do not deny them. But the point here is not to determine which theories in particular are true. It's to suppose that we try them collectively to weigh how seriously we should take conspiracy theories. And what I'm going to try to do is put forward, firstly, the basic affirmative argument. Conspiracies are real. Conspiracy theories should be taken seriously. And then I'll put forward some countervailing arguments. Why should we be suspicious of conspiracy theories? Why are they untrustworthy, malicious, even dangerous? And then, having looked at both sides, then lastly, I want to discuss the very idea of conspiracy theories as a category, and discuss why this whole conversation, this whole debate, as it has intensified in recent years, has been biased, unfair, and arguably skewed in favor of the powerful, especially the state, against private citizens, and discuss how these biases have been built into the very idea and category of conspiracy theory or conspiracy theorist, which need to be deconstructed. Okay, so if those are the three basic things we're hoping to do, let's begin firstly. Let's begin, you could say, with the prosecution side. What can be said in favor of conspiracy theories? Well, a lot of it has already been summed up in that discussion from Machiavelli, from his book from 500 years ago. Conspiracies are real. Historically, they have happened many times. They have sometimes brought down governments through coups or assassinations. They've also influenced governments through bribery or blackmail, and they have deceived both governments and the public through various frauds and deceptions. And hence, while it is true that most conspiracies fail, some of them do succeed in their goals, frequently enough to keep up the motivation and the incentive and to keep people trying them. Now, when we talk about conspiracy theories today, we tend to think the connotations call to mind conspiracies of shadowy, secretive government organs doing things to subvert the democratic process, deceive or prey upon the public. And there have been actual conspiracies that have been discovered in modern times over the last 100 years that would have seemed outlandish and fantastical if they had been known to the public before they were eventually exposed, or at least corroborated by additional evidence that shows them to be very likely true. Some of these might come to your mind very quickly. There have been covert programs like, for instance, MK Ultra, which was a whole system of experimentation spearheaded by the CIA that sought ways to control the minds and the memories of test subjects. The goal was to find methods of so-called brainwashing or mind control. And many test subjects, including soldiers and even unwitting civilians, medical patients, were given psychoactive drugs without their knowledge or consent, just to see what effects they would have. This is the sort of thing that the counterculture might have dreamed up in the 70s, but documentation has shown that it is true, and this was done in a widespread way across many, not only government installations, but also research universities and their laboratories all across the country. There have been systems to infiltrate, sabotage, and sometimes to destroy oppositional organizations, especially African American radical and oppositional organizations. There were long rumors and theories about this, and documentation shows it is true. There was the current, more recent scandal in Great Britain of so-called spy cops. Undercover police who posed as ordinary civilians, joined activist groups, sometimes found lovers, partners, fathered children, and then abandoned them once they revealed that they had been undercover government agents the whole time. This is a scandal still playing out in Great Britain that, as far as I have seen, has had no mention or coverage in the United States. There's also, of course, the classic example of Watergate, which was an actual conspiracy involving government organs as well as political operatives working for the President of the United States that involved spying on and stealing from citizens, political opponents. And in addition to these government conspiracies, there have also been conspiracies by businesses. There have been decades of illegal collusion, for instance, among light bulb manufacturers to make sure that light bulbs were designed in such a way that they would burn out. In principle, it is possible to produce a light bulb that will work indefinitely, and some were manufactured that are still working more than 100 years later. But businesses got together and colluded, and under the false front of establishing quality standards, they in fact established poor quality standards and agreed to take off the market any light bulb that lasted too long in order to make sure that consumers had to keep buying more of them. So this also might sound like a paranoid delusion put forward by a so-called conspiracy theorist, but in fact it's true. Now, more importantly, there also have been other conspiracies that were rumored and alleged to some degree in the public square and openly denied. There's a long history of this. For instance, in the early Republic, there were rumors and theories centering on Alexander Hamilton and his ambitions to sort of take over the government and to end the democratic republic and replace it with some sort of monarchy or dictatorship. And one of these rumors was of the so-called Prussian Plot, an alleged effort in 1786 by the sort of ring of extreme federalists around Hamilton to invite Prince Henry of Prussia to come over and take up the throne and become king of the United States. So this was at the time when the Articles of Confederation were in crisis. There was the beginning of a movement to try to replace and overthrow them with a more centralized government. And some people alleged that Nathaniel Gorham, the president of the Continental Congress, under the influence of Hamilton, actually made an invitation to Prince Henry to come to America and claim rulership. But this was, of course, denied by Hamilton and his allies. And for a long time it was considered a dubious theory. until in 1911, new evidence that had been discovered in the Prussian archives was published, and among other things, this evidence included a letter in Prince Henry's own papers in which he declined the offer of the throne. And although he was being modest or cautious, he actually recommended that Hamilton should invite a French prince for the job instead. So more than 100 years later, confirmation surfaces that in fact this offer was made, although we can't say for sure exactly who knew and who was involved to what degree. Now, aside from cases like the Prussian Plot, where it was at least openly denied, there are other government conspiracies that have been rumored and that were not only denied but were dismissed and derided as ludicrous or delusional, and that later turned out to be true. Now, one interesting instance that I'll talk about first, there are a few of them, probably some of you have heard of them, but one I'll talk about first is the U.S. involvement in the coup in Chile that overthrew the president and the democratically legal government of Chile on September 11th, 1973. So on that day, the President Allende, who was a Marxist socialist, was overthrown. The presidential palace was bombed and forcibly invaded by military forces, and the justifications for this coup included the fact that Allende's administration had dealt with severe economic troubles, especially rapid inflation, and they were overthrown by a plot among the military generals of Chile. And after taking over, the military, under the leadership of General Pinochet, proceeded to round up, torture, and kill thousands of members of the political opposition. Now, as soon as this coup happened, immediately there were rumors and allegations that the U.S. had been part of it, that they had given encouragement, weapons, money, etc., and helped to plot and plan this coup. These allegations were quickly dismissed, and significantly, the British-based magazine The Economist discussed this coup. They published an editorial in which they justified the coup, arguing that it was Allende's own fault, that he had mismanaged the economy, alleging that he had committed crimes and violated the Constitution and hence brought on the coup. But then also, they specifically denied the possibility of U.S. involvement, and they said in the last paragraph, quote, "General Pinochet and his fellow officers are no one's pawns. Their coup was homegrown, and attempts to make out that the Americans were involved are absurd to those who know how wary they have been in their dealings with Chile." So you might note that there's an odd tension, or maybe a contradiction here, in this editorial from The Economist. That on the one hand, the coup is perfectly justified, and on the other hand, one shouldn't allege that the Americans were involved. Why does one feel the need to deny that if, as one says, the coup is justified? But this sort of somewhat contradictory line of argument became the conventional wisdom, although conspiracy theories about the U.S. and the Chilean coup continued through the 1970s. And then finally, 25 years later in the 1990s, due to actions under the Freedom of Information Act, documents came out recording meetings between President Richard Nixon and the CIA. And these documents show that Nixon specifically wanted to sabotage the Chilean economy in order to destabilize Chile, undermine Allende and his regime, ideally prevent him from taking office at all in the first place, or if not that, overthrow him afterward. And the U.S. was fully involved in the plotting of the coup and the execution of it and the overthrow of Allende. And some U.S. citizens in different capacities actually took part in and advised the government that then carried out mass violence against opponents within Chile. So this particular instance of what you could call a conspiracy theory that turned out to be accurate is significant for several reasons. So there are several actors in this little drama that I want to point to. One is the involvement of Richard Nixon, who is a familiar figure to conspiracy theorists, And scholars, and I'll talk some about these more later, scholars who have studied conspiracy theories and who have tried to pull together observations about the phenomenon of conspiracy theories, they have specifically pointed to Richard Nixon as a prominent example of a paranoid conspiracy theorist who engaged in conspiracies himself. And this seems to be a frequent pattern that shows up in the history of politics and power, that people who view the world through a conspiratorial lens and who believe that others are plotting against them and who see these plots as threats, often then do the same thing and plot against others. You could say it's a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy, but it makes sense psychologically when you think about it. If you really believe that events in the world are due to plots and conspiracies, then in order to accomplish anything, you think you have to do the same thing yourself. And Nixon is a great example of that. Another factor that I'll point to, the second actor in this drama, you could say, is the CIA, which also, of course, is a classic fund and well of inspiration for conspiracy theories. The CIA is a secretive intelligence agency that plays a similar role to other agencies in other countries like MI5 in Great Britain and the KGB in the Soviet Union. It's a frequent object for conspiracy theories, but this also makes sense. It can be seen as almost inevitable. A lot of the CIA's power and influence in society derives from their secrecy, their mystery, and their air of seemingly unlimited power. And in these ways, these agencies and conspiracy theorists have a symbiotic relationship. There's a sort of exchange. These secretive agencies provide fodder, provide material, whether real or imaginary, to conspiracy theorists. And in return, the conspiracy theorists give them a mystique of power and of grand mystery. And yet, even so, at least in the case of the CIA, facts about their real activities often then come out after decades of delay. And this is especially true due to the Freedom of Information Act, which gives citizens, at least in principle, although it's often flouted, at least in principle, the Freedom of Information Act gives U.S. citizens power to demand inside information from these agencies in a way that has no equivalent in Great Britain. So every year, bit by bit, some of these conspiracy theories end up being confirmed, the Chilean coup being one of them. And yet, in that 25 or 30-year delay between real events and the release or declassification of documents gives a sort of convenient cover and allows a certain plausible deniability. Oh, sure, the CIA did things like that 25 or 30 or 40 years ago, but surely that doesn't happen anymore. At least if you are naive or unquestioning, you might see it that way. And so there is no sign that the behavior fundamentally changes or that there's serious reform. Reform in the sense that these agencies become accountable to someone else other than the executive branch of the government. And because of the way the state is structured, they are effectively immune to accountability or transparency. And that might give them the ability to maneuver and collect information more freely and to do their job more effectively, but it also, in effect, leaves the public free to speculate. And this constant speculation about the CIA or MI5 or MI6 has become, in a sense, normalized. It's become a sort of pastime, a form of entertainment, which apparently can have no effect on actual current policies and practices. A third actor in this drama we should look at is the role of The Economist. This publication, which has been widely respected, it is of course controversial, it has its critics, but it is an influential publication based in Britain, which in many ways serves to outline the boundaries of acceptable mainstream thought in the English-speaking world. People who read The Economist are respectable, right-thinking. They are not wild-eyed conspiracy theorists. And this entire editorial, interestingly, that I quoted from about the coup in Chile, has no specific facts. It does not provide any support for the claim that President Allende broke the law or violated the Constitution. I do not know whether or not that's true, and I'm not going to make any pronouncements on whether it's true. But it's significant that there's no supporting evidence for it in this editorial, nor do they present any arguments or evidence to refute the idea of U.S. involvement in the coup. It simply says that it's, quote, absurd to those, quote, who know how wary the United States has been with regard to Chile. Well, in reading that, I ask myself, those who know, like who? Who are you talking about? Not only is this left open and unsubstantiated, but the wording of it also hints. It hints at an intimacy with power. It hints at the possession of special inside information. And I think that whether or not that claim is true, that the editors of The Economist had some sort of inside track of information, either way, it serves as a good example of how media can also be symbiotic with government and with government agencies. The media can help to cover up or to reject or marginalize allegations of government misdeeds in return for this sort of special rarefied insider status, the sense that they have a special connection and inside access to the secrets of the circles of power, which they can then pass on in turn to readers. You get to be part of this insider circle if you read publications like The Economist. So with those observations in mind, I'll then briefly discuss a couple of other revealing cases, at least one of which I know some listeners have referred to. So the second one is the conspiracy through which the United States government, including the CIA, was complicit in the trafficking of cocaine, specifically crack cocaine, into the United States in the 1980s. So in the 80s, rumors surfaced and circulated in the US that crack cocaine, this sort of new, cheap, easy to traffic form of cocaine, had been created by the United States government or intentionally brought into the US and into black neighborhoods in order to attack and weaken the black community. So this idea was in the air for some number of years before then in 1996, the San Jose Mercury News published a series of articles which reported that, according to evidence that they had found in their investigation, in the 1980s, the CIA had sought to support and fund so-called Contra rebels in Nicaragua, and they had given money, supplies, and even airplanes to known drug traffickers. They had even allowed these drug traffickers to use CIA warehouses to store and move crack cocaine, and that these drug traffickers had then funneled the crack to specific dealers in California, in both Los Angeles and the Bay Area, thus helping to fuel and explode the crack epidemic. Now, this series of articles, not surprisingly, caused a firestorm. Some observers saw this as confirmation of this long suspicion that the CIA had aimed to undermine Black America with crack. And hence, many other outlets, such as the Washington Post, quickly reacted and debunked this claim. They said that there was no indication that CIA higher-ups had known about this drug trafficking activity. They also argued that the CIA had not known specifically where the crack was going. They were not directing it to Los Angeles or Oakland, etc. And some of them then tarred the original reports as conspiracy theories, and the main reporter for the San Jose Mercury News named Webb as a conspiracy theorist. Yet, as Webb and others replied, in fact, the original stories in the Mercury had not said that the CIA specifically wanted to push crack onto black people. They just argued that they had knowingly helped these drug traffickers and were complicit in that way. And furthermore, 2 years later, documents came out that showed that the CIA had actively discouraged DEA investigations into these Contra drug traffickers that they were supporting politically. So, one can debate the exact fine points of who precisely knew what, how complicit were individual U.S. officials, how complicit was the CIA in general, and what exactly was their aim or their hope. Was it just about turning a blind eye to misdeeds by a friend? Was it about actively encouraging and allowing a traffic that was bringing money to these Contras? Or was a factor about where this crack was going and the effect that it would have in America? But while all of those things are arguably debatable, this case is significant because it's one where accurate claims of misconduct were tarred and rejected by association. So critics linked these reports about CIA complicity together with different pre-existing claims about crack being a government conspiracy, about crack being a weapon that the government used against the black community. And so they put words into the accusers' mouths, and as a result, they rejected them as conspiracy theories, or one could speculate they did so in order to reject them, in order to marginalize or minimize these real revelations. And this is a pattern that one sees often again as well, that when claims or theories are put forward, especially ones that are critical of powerful institutions, they can then be linked by one or more degrees of separation to some other idea that one can then characterize as a conspiracy theory and then reject the whole line of argument completely. And lastly, a third instance that I'll mention where that sort of refutation was not so easy is in the case of the Echelon spying program. So Echelon was a program that set up a network of listening stations in 5 different countries. It began with the United States and the United Kingdom, and then also included Canada, Australia, and New Zealand in the so-called Five Eyes network. And Echelon set up various sites around these 5 countries where equipment could tap into and listen into long-distance communications through satellite signals, and then could collect large amounts of data from those signal taps, which could then be kept and compiled and searched through by these various 5 governments. So one of the possible benefits of Echelon is that it could provide a legal loophole, where it might be illegal or unconstitutional for the US government to collect and read information gained by spying on US citizens without a warrant. If that communication was being sent by satellite and then was being intercepted and collected in another country, then those countries could share the data with one another as a kind of workaround. So the existence of Echelon was alleged based on witnesses and leakers as early as the 1970s. It was formally investigated by an EU commission in 2001, which found the program to be real, although it could not figure out specifically exactly how much information and data it could collect and exactly how it was being used. Now, what might have become a larger scandal, it seems faded out of the news and out of public discussion because it was overshadowed by 9/11. But 12 years later, in 2013, NBC, as the so-called Snowden leaks were starting to come out and new allegations were surfacing about mass spying in the US, NBC did a short report examining different so-called conspiracy theories about internal spying. And one of the ones they made reference to was Echelon, and they called it, quote, a stretch. So at least they didn't dismiss it in this case as completely absurd or impossible, but they did say it was a stretch. But then shortly afterward, the existence of Echelon was confirmed by more documents that came out through the Snowden leaks. So this is another, you could say, marginalized theory that has been confirmed. Now, these are just a few examples. The Chilean coup, the complicity with cocaine trafficking, Echelon. These are a few examples of government conspiracies that have been found out and confirmed due to a paper trail coming out. And in some instances, it's because of the Freedom of Information Act and declassification many years later. In other instances, it's because of whistleblowers and leaks like Edward Snowden. And if that's the case, it's then reasonable to ask, how many other conspiracies may have taken place and may have succeeded? How many conspiracies might still be going on, and we just do not yet know about them? And so all of this should show, I think, the unfairness of simply rejecting conspiracies or rejecting conspiracy theories out of hand, rejecting them as such. As we've seen, conspiracies do happen. Sometimes what seems to be outlandish or absurd turns out to be true, or at least what some people describe as outlandish or absurd turns out to be true. And after all, it is just a matter of fairness and consistency because, as I'll mention again later, the term conspiracy is a term in law. The law itself acknowledges that conspiracies really happen. The state accuses people of conspiracy all the time. Corrupt racketeers, corrupt politicians, drug dealers, gangsters are routinely formally accused of the crime of conspiracy. So in this case, the state is accusing private citizens of this particular kind of misdeed. So then the question is, why can't citizens just do the same thing back to the state? Isn't it only fair? And hence, I would argue the stigma that has arisen against conspiracy theories is an effect of a power imbalance, including the imbalance of power between state and private citizens, which arguably is only increasing over time as the powers of surveillance and mass data collection increase year by year. Okay, so let's say Milicus, in this imaginary debate, rests his case here. Perhaps by now some of you have been persuaded that conspiracy theories are to be taken seriously, and at least evaluated in the same way we would any other sort of theory. Well then, now, what is the negative side? Suppose this is where Scaevinus comes into the room to refute these arguments. What are the reasons to be wary of, or even to reject outright, conspiracy theories? Well, to present this other side, I'd like to begin by simply telling another story. This story begins in the year 1320 in France. And in that year, a mob of angry peasants was marauding, raiding, and pillaging through the countryside of southern France, in theory in order to raise money, in order to go on a crusade. And during this tour, pillaging through southern France, reportedly one group robbed a so-called leprosarium, which is the word for a charity house for lepers. And at this time in medieval Europe, lepers tended to live in isolation or group quarantine, sometimes in these so-called leprosaria, in towns or in the countryside, which could sometimes grow fairly wealthy from donations and from commerce. Now, reportedly, this group that raided a leprosarium in 1320 found many barrels of stale or rotten bread. And later, when some of them were arrested by the local authorities, they speculated that this stale and rotting bread had been collected for the purpose of making poisonous powders, with which to contaminate drinking wells and fountains. In the following year, in 1321, as disease outbreaks increased through much of France, rumors exploded that this was the result of poisoning by the lepers. And under tremendous pressure from the common folk, municipal authorities around many parts of France began to arrest the leaders of the leprosaria. And under torture, many of these leading lepers confessed to a scheme to put poisonous powders, contaminated objects, and even pieces of diseased flesh into the people's wells and drinking fountains. And there are many reports about this supposed conspiracy that was uncovered all around France. For instance, in a chronicle written in Paris, the chronicle said that the lepers, quote, following a great deliberation in several assemblies held over a long time, created deadly poisons to be administered and given to all people not infected by their sickness. It was known that they put them in wells, in fountains, in wines, in wheat, and in other things necessary for the sustenance of men and women, so that all of those who would use or drink or eat these poisons will either die or lose their mind and be infected by the leper's illness. So a consensus formed fairly quickly that the lepers had made preparations for this nefarious scheme. But this led to the question of motive. Why would the lepers do such a thing? And different explanations were put forth. The first one, it seems, was recorded by an inquisitor named Bernard Gui, who wrote that, quote, "They aspired to the lordship of towns and castles, and had already divided among themselves the lordship of places, and given themselves the name of potentate, count, or baron in various lands, if what they planned should ever come about." But nonetheless, it seems doubts persisted that the lepers could have had the means, the motive, and the opportunity to carry out such an audacious scheme. And so some of the lepers who were still imprisoned were further tortured into more confessions. They said that they had been encouraged and assisted by the Jews. Then that the Jews in turn were in league with the Muslim rulers of Granada and Egypt, and that all of these conspirators in their meetings had profaned the sacraments and stomped upon crucifixes, signaling their alliance with Satan. Hence heresy, too, abjuration of the Christian doctrines, were brought in to this massive, far-reaching conspiracy. And finally, on this basis, dozens of lepers were killed all around France, mostly by burning at the stake. So this conspiratorial outbreak in France came about in the pivotal time of the early 1300s. So this was a period when high medieval society was coming into crisis. Through much of the 11 and 1200s, Western Europeans had spent this time building up a cohesive Western Christian society with consistent shared institutions, rituals, and teachings, which were symbolized by certain new ceremonies like the Corpus Christi, or Body of Christ processions, where the host would be paraded with various groups of society represented by delegations marching behind it, thus representing society as a unified body like the mystical body of Christ. But the dark side of this growing social cohesion was an increasing suspicion towards outsiders and nonconformists. And these suspicions then were set off with increasing fury after 1300, when there was a wave of floods, crop failures, and disease outbreaks. There was in the early 1300s, even before the eventual outbreak of the Black Death, there was a kind of general crisis, such as had not been seen since the fall of the Western Roman Empire. And it happens that lepers became the first scapegoats for this civilizational crisis, and they were put at the center of a new developing conspiratorial mythology. And it's not entirely surprising that it played out this way. Leprosy causes disfigurement and loss of skin tissue. And in the Middle Ages, this was often seen as symbolizing decay and degeneration, and that outer disfigurement symbolized inner sin and corruption. And so in this way, the lepers were seized upon both as a representative and a cause of the wider social crisis and decay. So whereas the body of Christ and the host represents the healthy and sanctified body, lepers were taken as representing the corrupted body. Now, the attack on lepers in 1321 was not entirely unprecedented. There were certain precursors. There had already been for more than 100 years the so-called blood libel on Jews, the persistent rumor, which was sometimes used as a rationale for violence, the rumor that Jews kidnapped and murdered Christian children in some way as part of their religious rituals. The blood libel claimed a collective crime for which Jews were collectively guilty. But it was not this collective crime, this fictitious ritual murder, was not necessarily aimed at subverting or destroying society as a whole. It was not used, you could say, mythically to explain a social crisis. But in 1307, another important forerunner of the attack on lepers took place, which was the formal state-sanctioned accusations against the Knights Templar. So this powerful crusading knightly order that had many knights and controlled a great deal of land and money all around Western Europe, The Templars were also accused of ritual crimes, like profaning the cross, and sexual crimes, in their case, homosexual sodomy. And they were also accused of plots and conspiracies against both the church and the crown. Hence why they should be not only executed as heretics, as many of them were, but also their lands and possessions seized for the crown because they were traitors. So the slanders and attacks on Jews and the destruction of the Templars served in these ways to lay the groundwork for the conspiracy theory about lepers. But what was new about the so-called leper plot in 1321 was that the lepers were the first social group that were perceived by the populace, not just accused by the crown, like the Templars, but perceived by the populace as scheming against mainstream society in order to harm or destroy it and to supplant the ruling elites. So in a way, the attack on lepers was a mass action, a popular action, in defense of the social order and the constituted authorities. And so one might see the Templar trials arguably as the crown unleashing a demon that then could not be contained. This idea that the social crisis of their time could be blamed on a conspiratorial group within society. And the 1321 alleged plot was the first one to unite together all of the common recurring villains that then appear again and again all through the history of conspiracy thinking in the West: Jews, Muslims, heretics. So the popular imagination seized in this case upon the leper house, the leprosarium, as a mysterious and forbidden place, a sort of alien place within society, which they came to see as dangerous, a place on which to project fantasies of malice and ambition. And it would then be followed soon after by Jewish synagogues, witches' covens, and eventually Masonic lodges. So the attacks on lepers in the 1300s set the tone and established certain common themes, which then run through a whole tradition of conspiratorial thinking in the West. And some of these common themes are, firstly, the projection of resentment and hatred of mainstream society onto marginal groups. Very often, those who were on the fringe or at the very bottom, the lowest strata of society, as the lepers were in this time. The thought process you could see as basically, if I were a leper, and if I were treated the way those people are treated, I would hate mainstream society. I would want to destroy it. So therefore, they must be plotting to destroy us. There's projection and also bad conscience, the feeling of one's own guilt, which one then imagines in the form of hatred, anger, and malice on the part of the outsider. And you can see a similar combination of projection and bad conscience with regard to many other objects of conspiracy theories through the years. Even in recent years, you might think about conspiracy theories around Barack Obama, linked to the sense that he is an angry black man, right? Why would one think of Barack Obama as an angry black man? Well, presumably because you know, maybe unconsciously, that if you were black and you saw the history of how black people were treated, you would feel angry and resentful. And so you project those feelings onto the other person, and then you imagine that they are plotting against you. Another very important common theme that comes into the story of the lepers and then continues all through the centuries is the fear of contamination. So many conspiracy theories all through the years involve poisoning of some sort, poisoning of the food supply, poisoning of animals. And this fear of poisoning is then applied to all kinds of groups that are in some way non-conforming or secretive, whether Jews, religious heretics, and then broadly to anyone who is seen as marginal or harboring ill intent. So this combination of projection, bad conscience, fear of conspiratorial plotting and fear of contamination and poisoning is applied to all of those groups, and then also following the Reformation, it often is applied to Catholics in Protestant countries and to Protestants in Catholic countries. Now, also around this same time, during and just after the Reformation, these various plots and conspiracies are increasingly connected and woven together into a sort of grand overarching conspiracy, which has a single mastermind, a puppet master, which is Satan himself, and hence the rising belief in witchcraft and the great witch hunt. So witchcraft is something that people had believed in some form and sometimes saw as a threat, right? Bad black magic, the evil eye, maleficium. This had been part of the Western belief system in the Middle Ages, but then it came to be seen as diabolical and as a threat to society as a whole, not just to particular victims, but to society itself after 1480, when the Great Witch Hunt explodes. Witchcraft becomes the great boogeyman of the Renaissance era through the 15 and 1600s. And according to the ideology of the Great Witch Hunt, witches not only flew around and cast spells, but they met together in secret groupings at night, they communed with the devil, signed the devil's book, and they acted as soldiers carrying out plots to attack and weaken Christian society. So witchcraft in that era was not simply a superstition, a folk belief in evil magic, but it was a conspiracy theory. And I think you could say, in a sense, it is the greatest overarching conspiracy theory of Western history. So these enduring themes of the conspiratorial tradition, fear of impurities, fear of contamination of the body, they imply a parallel, a sort of symbolic, metaphysical parallel between the individual's physical body and the social body. So as I said, in the late Middle Ages, there arose this idea of the Corpus Christi, the mystical body of Christ, which is then instantiated in the unified body of society with all its various members, like limbs on a body. And hence, by this logic, distinct sub-societies, whether you're talking about Jews, stonemasons, witches, these distinct sub-societies are like alien growths within the body that introduce poisons and impurities. And this kind of fear, I would argue, continues all through the different eras and evolutions of the conspiratorial tradition. And hence, when you think of recent conspiracy theories or fears closely linked to conspiracy theories, they focus on things like fluoride, vaccines, radiation like the 5G network, chemtrails, etc., etc. There is, I would argue, not only an enduring but an intensifying fear of bodily impurities being introduced into people's literal physical bodies and into the social body. And this is due, I think, to the loss of many bodily taboos. We now have fewer or very loosened taboos about diet, sex, dress, etc. And in response to that, there's a compensating need to protect one's essences, right? You might say our precious bodily fluids, in Stanley Kubrick's words. And then if one thinks of the most, possibly the newest, current fear that drives many current conspiracy theories, it's of transhumanism. The idea that humans, the biological human being, can be intercombined with machines, and that the boundaries between the human and the inhuman, the organic and the inorganic, the living and the non-living, can be transgressed to give rise to a sort of hybrid entity. And you may have heard the for a time, very successful conspiracy theorist Alex Jones said that transhumanism would bring, quote, a new dark age. A lot of these recurring themes even came together in an interesting incident last fall, when a private company organized a conference about, quote, technology that empowers humanity, and which included keynote speakers who were co-authors of a book called The Transhuman Code. So this set off, of course, many conspiracy theorists' imaginations. It caused a lot of alarm. And as if that was not bad enough, the conference was held at the Vatican City. And so in this way, the Catholic Church, and particularly the Vatican, were brought back into the center of conspiracy panic. The Catholic Church has been already an object of many conspiracy theories in the Anglophone world. And so many leapt on this conference as a sign that the Vatican was endorsing transhumanism, and hence it had been taken over by Satan and the Antichrist. And this, of course, might sound extreme, but it is also not a new idea. The notion that the Pope is an Antichrist and a puppet of Satan has been put forward frequently by Protestants and by other enemies of the Catholic Church, including by Luther himself, who in the Babylonian captivity of the Church wrote that the Church was under the grip of Satan and Antichrist. So the news service Reuters issued a fact check on this sort of upwelling of conspiratorial fear around this conference in Rome. And Reuters pointed out that the Vatican was not formally sponsoring the event. It was being held by a private company. It just happened to take place in the Vatican City. And they pointed out the connection to an existing theory, which they also rejected, that vaccines are the so-called mark of the beast, signaling the end times. Now, one could say that this fact check by Reuters was a valiant effort, but of course it is very unlikely to sway those who have been immersed in conspiratorial thinking and the conspiratorial tradition. You may know many conspiracy theorists tend to be extremely stubborn and very closed, unable to hear and process counter-arguments. And also, historically, conspiracy theorists have been practiced for centuries in this practice of piecing together signs and clues, especially hidden or coded signs of corruption and of impending evil and doom. And over the centuries, conspiracy theorists have built up their own sort of parallel version of history, a version of history that is providential, in which everything happens for a reason, in which every word and image has a meaning. And this alternate version of history is in many ways open-ended and flexible. It's frequently being revised, it's frequently evolving, but it still has these constant themes, like the ones that I have mentioned. The theories in this tradition center usually on fear of internal outsiders, especially Jews. Jews are the largest minority religion in Europe, and Christian society traditionally has defined itself against Jews. There is a deep ambivalence and inner conflict in Christian society, rooted even in the Bible itself, wherein Jews are a special chosen people. They are the apple of God's eye. They are the centerpiece of God's providential history, at the same time that they refuse conversion and reject Christ. And conspiracy theories very often serve to express this ambivalence, this mixture of fear and suspicion, while also seeing Jews as providential drivers of history. So anti-Semitic conspiracy theories were extremely prevalent right from that moment in the late Middle Ages on up into the 1700s. They did go somewhat out of fashion. Conspiracy theories centering on Jews waned somewhat after the French Revolution, at a time when the power of the church was diminished and when Jews gained a greater degree of legal and even social acceptance in the West. And those anti-Semitic conspiracy theories were somewhat supplanted for a time by those that centered on supposedly revolutionary secret societies like the Masons and the Illuminati. And the historian Gordon Wood has made the argument that the French Revolution had a great impact because people, at the time when that revolution broke out, did not have a sense of the grand sweep or of grand impersonal forces of history. And if they were not relying on divine providence as an explanation, which didn't seem to apply well to the French Revolution, then they needed to look for a culprit, some active thinking agent who intentionally brought these events about. and so they looked for groups like Masons, Illuminati, and so on. And in this way, this brings into relief the fact that most of these conspiracy theories are classic myths. They're efforts to find a moral agent and a moral agency behind events, rather than accepting chaos or meaninglessness. Now, it happens that I can say these conspiracy theories about Masons as causes of revolutions are mistaken. They've continued to show up in different forms all the way up through the 20th century, even in scholarship. Really, the first scholarly history of the Masons was called Freemasonry and Revolution. It was by a right-wing French scholar, Bernard Failly. But in fact, the Masons, if you look at them based on the evidence, are a very diffuse and decentralized movement, and they do not function as a cabal. But putting that aside, as I said, my purpose here is not to pronounce on what theories are true or false, but to evaluate what they mean, what they stand for. So for a time in the 1800s, Jews were eclipsed as the main center of conspiratorial theorizing until after 1900, when they came back to the center, largely due to the book called The Protocols of the Elders of Zion. So this book brought Jews back to the center of the conspiratorial imagination. It is a forged, fraudulent Russian book that supposedly presented the records of secret meetings of Jews, where the leaders of international Jewry plotted to control the world through media and business. It first appeared in serial form in Russia in 1903, and then in 1905 it was published in a complete form as an appendix to a book called The Great in the Small, The Coming of the Antichrist and the Rule of Satan on Earth. The attachment of the protocols onto this Russian apocalyptic book shows the connection of conspiracy thinking to end times apocalypticism, and also to the search for small clues with big meanings. A sort of esoteric quest can be undertaken through conspiracy theorizing. After the Russian Revolution, when many right-wing or reactionary Russians fled the country, the protocols was spread abroad all through Europe and other parts of the world. It was quickly translated into multiple languages. It was brought to the Middle East, translated into Arabic, and used to foment anti-Semitism in the Arab and Muslim world. It also was printed in the United States by Henry Ford, who was an extreme anti-Semite. From the 1930s onward, the book was repeatedly debunked and shown to be a tissue of stolen materials taken from other books and pamphlets that were not originally about Jews. You can imagine they did a sort of word search and replace function and made it about Jews. And yet nonetheless, despite these debunkings, many people still cling to it. They frequently ignore the counter-arguments against it, or they claim that the book still captures some sort of higher truth, even if it is itself a forgery. And this is a line of thinking that you see often among conspiracy theorists, but also among many others as well. Sometimes things we took to be real get exposed or debunked, but we still hold on to them as capturing some sort of more important truth, some higher reality. And the book serves to provide explanations for complex events and to point to scapegoats. In this way, again, it serves as a myth. It is used to help explain the tumultuous events of the 20th century, like the World Wars, the Russian Revolution, the Great Depression, and in this way it exemplifies the whole tradition of conspiracy theories. All of these in some way function as myths in the sense of stories that are used to assign moral meaning and blame for events and to avoid the idea of history governed by chaos and randomness. The conspiracy theories also appeal to particular proclivities. The mindset of conspiracy theorists often shows a need for order, sense, meaning, and certainty. And some people you've probably seen in your own life exemplify this mindset in extreme form. Right? When it becomes salient, you notice it. People who are committed to their preferred myths that clarify the world and who are often unable to process counter-arguments. But again, I would emphasize really everyone can engage in this kind of inflexible thinking. Everyone has some sort of sacred myths. It's just a question of which ones you embrace and why. Also, I should point out, as other historians and commentators have, the conspiracy theory tradition is embraced through the years not just by the stupid, ignorant masses. Right? Remember, if we think all the way back to the leper plot of 1321, it was inquisitors, municipal authorities, mayors, sheriffs, and even the crown that bought into that theory and carried out those punishments. And conspiracy theories are often propagated by the most respected, upstanding, and well-educated citizens of society. That pattern is seen not only in Europe, but arguably even more so in America. So there is, I would say, an American conspiratorial tradition, which is related to the European tradition, but slightly different in some ways. After the American Revolution, the American conspiratorial tradition gradually branched off and diverged from its European counterpart. It draws from European ideas, especially Anglo-Protestant conspiracy thinking, but also evolves in its own directions. And I would argue that this is part of the very foundation of distinctive American civic culture, is the fact that we have our own conspiratorial tradition. In the American tradition, Jews are less central. They are still a factor sometimes. They do play into American conspiracy theories, mainly among the more extreme fringe and the reactionary fringe. But in American conspiratorialism, the bigger villains are the Masons and also particularly the Catholic Church and the Pope. Generally in Europe, conspiracy theorists tend to see only one or the other as the villain. Many paranoid thinkers in Europe are friendly to the Masons and detest the Catholic Church, or are Catholic and fear and detest the Masons as a subversive element. Well, to American conspiracy theorists, they're free to sort of mix and match, and often see the Freemasons and the Catholic Church as dangerous. The first grassroots organized political party in the United States, and the first one to organize a party convention, was the anti-Masonic Party in the 1820s and 30s. Beyond that, the really big overarching controversy in 19th century America, other than slavery, was anti-Catholicism. And even the fight against slavery, which led to the Civil War, even the opponents of slavery built up an electoral majority in the United States, not through moral arguments about the injustice of slavery in itself, but rather they did so through claiming the existence of a slave power, a shadowy conspiratorial cabal that was controlling the federal government and that was plotting to extend slavery everywhere throughout the country, not just into the Western territories, but even into the free states of the North, and that was plotting to subject poor white workers to enslavement, as well as blacks. And it was really this conspiratorial thinking that actually built and extended the Republican base, leading eventually to the Civil War. So conspiratorial thinking is clearly deeply important and even central in the politics of the American Republic. But nonetheless, it was not generally considered a proper subject of historical study until 1960, with the publication of an article by the historian David Bryan Davis, a landmark article called Some Themes of Counter-Subversion, an analysis of anti-Masonic, anti-Catholic, and anti-Mormon literature. And this article is sort of a watershed in first trying to bring together these patterns of conspiratorial paranoia and fear of subversion and making them a central subject in American history. So David Bryan Davis pointed out similarities among the different fears and theories about these three supposedly subversive groups: Masons, Roman Catholics, and Mormons. The common theme was the notion of a foreign body within the body politic that was separate and distinct and operated autonomously outside the democratic process. The loyalties of their members were suspect. All of them were often associated in some way with Europe, with authoritarianism and hierarchy, and with sexual license. So just to look at each of the three briefly. As for anti-Masonic conspiracy theories, these are arguably the most lasting and still capture the imaginations of many people. The Masons were the targets of repeated panics, many of which were completely delusional and unfounded, but some of which at least had some sound basis in concerns about favoritism and corruption. Anti-Masonry gradually faded out through the 20th century, but in the 21st century, there's been something of a revival of conspiracy theories about Masons. It's been revived due to their association with the Knights Templar and the Holy Grail, and in this way have been drafted into being a character in these new sort of humanistic theories about a benign and beneficent conspiratorial network that keeps some sort of humanistic sacred secret. Obviously, the Da Vinci Code is just one instance of this. As for anti-Mormonism, from early on, the Mormons were targets of mob violence, such as the mob that killed Joseph Smith by throwing him out a window. Later, they became subjects of intense political controversy, such as the dispute over statehood for Utah. And you may know there was a stipulation that Utah had to ban the practice of polygamy before it was allowed to join the Union in 1890. And conspiracy theories about Mormons often were spurred on by their traditional practice of polygamy and its connection to sexual taboos. So conspiracy theories, as I've argued, often hinge on fear of contamination or defilement of the body. And this shows up in the form of poisoning and also of sexual license and sexual sins. So with regard to conspiracy theories about the Sabbateans, the offshoot Jewish Messianic group in Europe, they were often accused of group sex and orgies, with more or less support in fact. As for the Masons, they were sometimes accused of homosexual sodomy. This goes all the way back to early years in the 1750s when there was a series of cartoons and libels really printed in the Boston Newsletter depicting Masons sodomizing one another with different objects, and also with regard to Roman Catholics. So ironically, what set Catholics apart was their celibate clergy, their priests, monks, and nuns. But this then, by conspiracy theorists, this was cast as a fraudulent covering up sexual license, fornication, and illegitimate children, and so on, in the convents. So really, all in all, Catholic conspiracies were the most prevalent and the most fundamental in American thinking. It goes back to the colonial background and the inherited Anglo-Protestant fear of Catholic subversion. It was exemplified by the celebrations of Pope's Day, or as it's now called, Guy Fawkes Day, when colonists would burn effigies of Guy Fawkes, the Catholic conspirator who had tried to help blow up the king in Parliament in England back in 1605. This fear of subversion, of an attack on society by Catholic conspirators transferred to America, and then during and after the Revolution, that fear then was also directed back at Britain. Ironically, even though that is where this particular brand of anti-Catholicism had come from, Britain then became the new villain. And this was due to the accommodations that the British government made to French Canadians after the capture of Canada, such as, for instance, the Quebec Act. So during the Revolution, fears increased that Britain was plotting to somehow impose Catholicism on America, or that there was some conspiratorial, disloyal element in the British government that was trying to use the crisis in order to open the door for a Jacobite invasion and a reimposition of Catholicism in Britain. Ezra Stiles, the minister in Newport who later became president of Yale, actually put forward this theory that the reason the British government sent British military units to America during the Revolution was in order to leave the country undefended and allow a Jacobite restoration. These conspiracy theories diminished somewhat after the American alliance with France, but then there was a great new upsurge of paranoia about Catholics in the 1830s, when there was a new wave of Catholic immigration from Germany and Ireland. And this new conspiracy thinking often revolved around theories of sexual depravity in the convents. For this reason, a convent in Charlestown, Massachusetts was attacked and burned down in 1834. And 2 years later, in 1836, a book called The Confessions of Maria Monk was published, which was a fake memoir of a supposed former nun, claiming that illicit sex between priests and nuns, abortions, and infanticides were taking place in these convents. And then later again in the 20th century, in the 1910s, during the period of fear and paranoia around World War I, new conspiracy theories were created involving the Knights of Columbus. A fake Knights of Columbus oath was circulated, according to which supposedly the new knight had to pledge to kill Protestants and throw Protestant babies against the wall and dash out their brains, etc. And this fake oath was used as a recruiting tool by the Ku Klux Klan, which in large part at this time was anti-Catholic. And also I've mentioned in my lecture about Florida the case of Sidney Johnston Katz, the governor of Florida, who claimed that German Catholic monks in Florida were plotting to assassinate him and to foment an insurrection to transfer Florida to Spain. So in all of these different episodes, Catholicism took on a special symbolic role, symbolizing Europe, the Old World, patriarchalism, everything that stood against American Republican values. Catholics' loyalties were considered to be suspect. Immigrants were seen as dangerous because of their ambiguous identities. They were neither American nor foreign. And this is illustrated, I think, in Samuel F.B. Morse's conspiracy theory writings. So the artist and engineer who invented the telegraph, he was also an avid conspiracy theorist, and he described Catholic immigrants in America as hermaphrodites, not clearly belonging to one group or the other. And I think this terminology reflects this continuing fear of hybridity, of violations of boundaries, of ambiguity. Morse also illustrates a pattern that I mentioned before with respect to Europe, which is even more true in the United States, which is that conspiracy theories were not just propagated by the ignorant, uneducated masses, but often by those who were most highly educated and most respected. And Morse himself was a Yale graduate who then studied art overseas in Britain and in Europe, and who was one of the most eminent leading lights of America, a professor at NYU, an inventor. And he wrote a series of books culminating in one called Foreign Conspiracy Against the Liberties of the United States, which alleged that the Jesuit order was plotting to take over America, and which helped spread this sort of conspiracy theory, not just about Catholicism, but about the Jesuits in particular. So it's pretty undeniable that this is a constant running theme through really all of American history. But periodically, every few years, there's a sort of moral panic then about conspiracy theories, not just about conspiracies threatening America, but about the theories threatening to undermine American democracy and sort of drag America into the Dark Age. And if you talk about conspiracy theories today, many people very quickly think of the famous article from 1966, so just a few years after David Bryan Davis's article that I mentioned. They think of the historian Richard Hofstadter's article from 1966 called The Paranoid Style in American Politics. And this article describes the sort of hyperbolic style characteristic of conspiracy theorists. The indulgence in Manichaean fantasies about a coming confrontation between forces of absolute good and absolute evil. The insistence that their conspiracy theories have been absolutely proved beyond any shadow of a doubt, and their efforts to prove them not usually by sound reasoning, but instead by sheer quantity of evidence, as if the number of pages and citations proves their point. And you can see something of the conspiratorial mindset at work here that habitually discerns patterns and meanings out of what might otherwise seem to be chaos. And the conspiracy theorist assumption seems to be that if one stares at the sort of chaotic mass of information and data points for long enough, a picture must emerge. And this article, The Paranoid Style, was written partly because of a rising sort of fear that in the wake of the Kennedy assassination, the sort of tide of madness was rising in the populace and threatened to overwhelm elite circles that ought to be managing knowledge, discourse, politics. And the article is a pretty insightful description of a style, of a certain style of thought and writing. But at the same time, it gives no explanation of how or why this mindset arises. And as many have pointed out, it gives the impression that this is only a fringe phenomenon by sort of kooks and unqualified, unaccredited pseudo-intellectuals. But critics have pointed out that really this is not true. This is an all-pervasive phenomenon. It's continuous through American history, and it is powerful among all sorts of elites, as well as the sort of middle-brow public. And this point is made explicitly, particularly by the journalist Jesse Walker in his book from a few years ago called United States of Paranoia, where he points to the conspiracy theories swirling around Andrew Jackson and his critics and opponents in the Jacksonian age, and how there really is no period of American history when conspiracy theories were not powerful. And he does a play on the title of Hofstadter's article and says that what Hofstadter missed is that, quote, the paranoid style is American politics. Now, a lot of these themes, these conspiratorial themes I've been talking about, involving Catholics, Jews, Freemasons, these can sound rather old-fashioned, rather outmoded. And what you'll probably find is that since the furor over the Kennedy assassination, beginning around 1970, there has been a shift, a new development in the American conspiratorial tradition, which arguably you could see as signaling a kind of break and the development of a new modern tradition, which focuses much more on state organs, including principally the CIA, but also the FBI and the NSA, and which focus a lot on issues of secret knowledge, methods of information gathering, and population control. A lot of this kind of new brand of conspiracism is summed up and made into material for entertainment in the television show The X-Files, in which sort of this new conspiratorial realm was brought into pop culture. And it really came to the fore, arguably. The X-Files shows how it really came to the fore after the end of the Cold War. And a lot of it was stimulated by fears of innovations that came from the Cold War. Technological innovations, efforts that I mentioned about mind control, brainwashing, these sort of methods then being turned onto the domestic American population, now that the Soviet enemy no longer existed as a target. And this new recent conspiracism is futuristic. It involves a lot of anxiety over technological change and scientific frontiers. This is, of course, where aliens have gradually come into the center of conspiratorial thinking, although I would argue it seems in the last decade or two they've actually faded out again, now that even more evidence is being confirmed about possible extraterrestrial craft. Conspiracy theorists don't seem to care, which is inconceivable if this had happened, say, 30 years ago. But rather, a lot of 21st century conspiracism centers on techniques of surveillance and control, such as the use of microchips. Also, in recent years, the notion of people actually being deep fakes or crisis actors, sort of simulated people. And I think that these recent theories combine technological anxieties with the classic long-standing fears of breaking human boundaries and of sort of corrupting or contaminating the human body. There's fear of human-animal hybrids or human-alien hybrids, and that turned out, of course, to be an overarching theme in the X-Files, a secret effort to cross humans with aliens. Fears of implanted microchips, which could be the beginning then of creating a human-machine hybrid. And when it comes to deepfakes and crisis actors, the sort of hybridity of simulated people and the uncanny, a sort of combination of what seems to be the human form with the kind of phantasmic virtual existence of technological fabrication. So I would argue there are these various strands of conspiratorial thinking that have certain unifying themes and patterns, and that sometimes come together into grand unified theories that involve all of the above. Sort of like the leper conspiracy theory from 1321 brought together fear of Jews, Muslims, heresy, etc. You can see a similar phenomenon in the colonial period when fear of conspiracy among Roman Catholics, Indians, and witches, and in turn through the witches to Satan, all combined together. And when it comes to the Salem witch trials, people have put forward all kinds of theories and interpretations about why Salem happened. But if you look at a very important seminal book about the Salem witch trials called In the Devil's Snare by Mary Beth Norton, she simply goes back to the testimonies and allegations that people actually made at the time. And what you find is that the accusers and the people who believed them in Salem did not just think that the witches were meeting in a coven and signing the devil's book. They also believed that they were flying out to the distant frontier, meeting with Native Americans. The first person accused of being a witch at Salem was Tituba, an Indian slave. And they also then, through the Native Americans, were meeting and conspiring with the great Catholic enemy, which is France, and through that with the Pope and ultimately the devil himself. So once again, witchcraft was not just a superstition, and it was not just a way for neighbors to get petty revenge on one another. It was a grand unified conspiracy. And in recent years, I think you can see a somewhat similar phenomenon with QAnon. Now, I will not go through all the contents and claims and insinuations of QAnon. It's not something I've studied. I'm not going to get into it. But it is clear that QAnon unites together many different strands of conspiratorial thinking. A lot of the things I've already mentioned, transhumanism, microchips, Jews, the Elders of Zion, and so on, all somehow play into it. It's basically a rehashing of mostly recycled material. And included in it, of course, is the allegation of sexual depravity. And in this case, specifically, child molestation by secretive elite circles. And that only makes sense considering that so many other sexual taboos, like polygamy, group sex, homosexuality especially, those taboos really have faded out, or at least faded far into the background of American thinking. And the one sexual taboo that remains, that really still carries a charge of horror and disgust, is pedophilia. So that's the one that then is used in QAnon. And moreover, the people who produce QAnon, who have inspired it, including the anonymous person or group called Q, they structure the theory not simply as a claim or an argument, but as a game, a series of puzzles and hunts, which then play upon this common drive to find and uncover secrets, to, you could say, unlock the code of the world, of what seems to be the chaotic world. And at root, it plays into this very basic instinct to discern patterns. So QAnon you could see as a recent kind of flourishing of the American conspiratorial tradition in a particular form, which really is possible now with the internet, with the interactive world of hypertext and online interaction. But really, in either branch, whether we're talking about European or American conspiratorial thinking, the theories serve very much as expressions of distrust, ways of showing fear or distrust towards unknown, and in recent years more and more towards powerful and mysterious institutions. And they can serve as metaphors also for injustice and exploitation. So conspiratorial thinking and conspiracy theories have been found to be especially common and prevalent in the African American community. You might think of conspiracy theories about the origins of crack, HIV, and if one looks beyond Europe, there is a great prevalence of conspiracy theories also in colonial environments, where people are negotiating and trying to deal with foreign powers occupying and exploiting their country. You might think of the so-called Sepoy Mutiny in India in 1857, when the mercenaries, the Hindu and Muslim mercenaries who were working in the employ of the British East India Company, rose up in rebellion against the British, and it was triggered by rumors and theories that the ammunition cartridges that these soldiers had to use and that they had to bite into in order to use had been contaminated with animal fats from beef or pork or both, and hence they were violating the dietary taboos of both Muslims and Hindus. And so again, it drew upon this sense of the body being contaminated with impurities. This was the thing that finally then united Muslims and Hindus together in a sort of shared consciousness against the British, against these outsiders. And there have been more recent examples. For many years, there were common rumors, which are sometimes referred to as vampire stories or vampire rumors, in Africa, especially in southern Africa. Now, the content of these rumors, they were collected and analyzed in a book called Speaking with Vampires. They allege that colonial authorities would kidnap various African people, hold them in some sort of laboratory or dungeon, and drain their blood and use it to make medicines or food that the British colonists needed. Now, you can imagine, although this is not how they were interpreted in the book Speaking with Vampires, you can imagine how these sorts of stories and theories could easily serve as metaphorical expressions for the sense that Britain was draining Africa and draining resources and power out from the African population. So there are all these sorts of social and ideological purposes that we can see conspiracy theories serving for different audiences all through the centuries. But nonetheless, there's still the psychological question of conspiracy theories. Why do some people believe in them and not others? After all, in all of these different eras, with all of these different furors around alleged conspiracies, there have always been some believers and some skeptics. Why is that? Why do some people embrace certain theories and others don't? And as a corollary, isn't there something wrong with conspiracy theorists? Isn't there a certain sort of person that all of us can recognize who absorbs these different theories, who spins different theories, and it seems impossible to dissuade them? So the question of conspiracy theories and why certain people believe them has been taken up periodically in social science research since the 1930s. So this phrase conspiracy theory was extremely rare. It was not really part of the language up until it started to appear at a low level in the 1920s, probably because of alarm over the Russian Revolution, Bolshevism, the First Red Scare. And then in the 1930s, some scholars began to research about conspiracy theories, and since that time, it's gradually grown in prominence as a bigger and bigger focus of social science research.